Hi, welcome to the first episode of Nova History Club's podcast. Today, our guest is Professor Luciano Amaral. I'm João, and
How'd you go?
we're both members of the content department, and we will be interviewing our guest. Our discussion today is about colonization and its economic and political effects on nations. And we will start by looking at the different paths countries took after colonization and its economic impacts. Our first question is, how have different economic systems, specifically settler-driven colonialism and extractive economies and colonies, have shaped different economic growths in colonies?
Well, first, thank you for the invitation. I didn't know this was the first podcast, so first episode. So it's an honor to be the first one to be interviewed. And it's I know what you mean. There are the settler and the non-settler systems of colonization. The settler ones are perhaps easier to understand than the others because what we know is that colonization was very varied in the sense that the colonizing powers were very different. The places that they colonized were completely different. So the interaction between the two actions, so to speak, would result in complex outcomes. In the case of the settler economies, there are those very famous, say, good cases: the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These are settler economies that work well. I can actually say that the most important country in the world today is a former European colony. So those worked well. Perhaps it's easier to explain why they worked well because none of this is easy to explain, but there are some elements that allow us to understand more or less why that happened. We're talking of a population of European origin moving to places where there was very little native presence, and the one that existed was set aside violently or less violently, but Europeans came to European type population came to predominate. That's easier to explain due to the cultural attitudes or the institutions that were already typical of Europe from a certain point onwards, so that what they could do is sort of reproduce whatever already existed in Europe institutionally and culturally. So it's easier to explain that. But for instance, there are settler economies, such as those in South America or Central America, that didn't work in the same way. So the path of growth was not as good. So maybe there's an easier explanation for that. As for the others, the variety is enormous. The approach that the Europeans had, the cultures that they existed. For instance, it's very easy to distinguish between Africa or Asia, even in terms of their current levels of development. We know that a lot of Asian countries are now among the richest countries in the world, starting with Japan or South Korea. Yes. China is fast approaching. So then if we look at Africa, it's more difficult to find that sort of success cases. Was the colonization different? Was it that the people existing there were different, so the interaction resulted in a different thing? So the situations are quite varied. Maybe the 4 or 5 settler cases that we know that work are the simpler to explain, because then even in Africa we have settler cases. For instance, what used to be South Africa, Rhodesia, those countries. And again, the situation is quite different from what we
Don't
find.
work out so well as America.
Not at all. Yeah. Not at all. So you see, a lot of different cases, and well, yeah. One thing I would perhaps like to tell is that many times we think, many of the ideas sometimes we have about colonization is that colonization was the ultimate determinant of the fact that some countries became rich or poor. Perhaps it wasn't. Let me try and elaborate a little bit on this. I mean, sometimes the idea is if the British or the Portuguese had never been to Africa, that Africa would be growing fantastically. So that's the question. Perhaps not. We don't know. Perhaps yes, but we don't really know. We need to understand better what existed before, what the Europeans brought, what the combination of the two allowed for. I mean, for instance, in Africa, it's true the Portuguese got there in the 15th century, but they were never able to fully control local societies up to the 20th century. So, I mean, they would have some trade outposts here and there on the coast, but most of African societies didn't really interact with Europeans because only in the 20th century, with high colonization, things changed. Well, was that enough to determine? So you see, these are the types of questions that
I think we'll see from the interview the effects and why are some more developed, some less, and if Europe developed at the expense of colonies, or if Europe didn't colonize these countries, were they richer than European countries? So,
is that a question?
No.
Okay.
That brings us to the next question. In what ways did the flow of resources, labor, and capital between empires and their colonies influence economic trajectories of both sides during the 20th century?
I mean, we're again talking of a large variety of situations, right? So, I mean, again, it's very different talking of what was it that Europe brought to Africa, and to the local institutions and economies, and what it brought to Asia. So it's quite different. If we try to, and again, getting back to the question I was hinting a bit at when I was with what I was saying before. I mean, so the Europeans, what was that they brought to those places? They brought, for instance, capital. Could be good for investment. Or capital, yes, was certainly good for investment. There was a certain type of investment. If it was good or not, that's another thing. They brought their own technologies. So they introduced some of them in the colonies. So the question is always, again, going back to what I was saying, is would certainly the colonized societies and economies would be much different without the European influence. But without that influence, would they, again, have like high capital labor ratios allowing for economic growth, technologies allowing for economic growth, human capital formation allowing for economic growth? When the Europeans got there, the level, say, of literacy of traditional societies was virtually zero, or close to zero. So see what I mean? So certainly there were good, let's say, good things in the sense that there were things that could help economic growth happen, and bad due to the extractivist approach that many times they had. But the balance, I mean, the balance is not always straightforward.
I think the best way to answer that question, like, would they be better off if we'd never gotten there?
We would never. We can't know, right?
Yeah,
So that's the first
sure.
question. First thing we should say is that
It's impossible to tell.
it's impossible to tell. So It's impossible to tell. From the point of view that I'm taking, which is be careful about what was it that really happened, but also from the point of view of people that say that colonialism destroyed the possibilities of development of those places.
I think
so. It's never you
we can't really make a generalization because each case is different, and we could. What I was thinking was we could explore examples like countries that were not colonized, say in Africa or Asia. I don't know if you know any examples. I know that Ethiopia was never colonized.
No, colonized
Directly, eventually attacked by Italy.
Only in Italy, very briefly.
Yeah, and we don't see necessarily a great
Good
growth or development in Ethiopia compared to other African nations or nations in Asia who are
Many were not colonized.
yeah, or some that were colonized and are extremely developed when compared to others. So we can't really tell if it's directly caused by colonialism.
Certainly, colonialism had an influence. The question is, well, a straightforward answer saying was good or bad. I don't believe in any of them, so it's not possible to say that it was always good or always bad. Depends on the cases. Depends on the European approach. Depends on the reception part. What was the culture that already existed there? Depends on the strength of colonization. A lot of things enter into the picture, and I think that best approach is to be a bit humble about conclusions and study cases so that we can
understand them one by one.
Yeah, or types, at least some types. For instance, the approach settler, non-settler is already uncovers some things, right? But there are always the exceptions, such as the settler economies that didn't work.
Yeah,
well,
we're talking about South American settler economies.
Well, yes, Argentina, Brazil, all those were settler economies.
Yes.
See, so
Brazil, totally a settler economy or like a partial? Because at some point, the point of the colonization of Brazil was the exploration of sugar and eventually the gold mines, and that would make it an extraction colony.
Well, South Africa was also extracted, with the mines and so on. So, what I mean settler is that there was a large group of. It's different from the type of approach where there's only a few European, entrepreneurs and rulers for a large mass of a native population. That's the typical approach in most of Africa. South Africa is different because there was a settler.
The ratio between colonists and natives was
and in South America too. So
yes.
Many of those cases where you have a large European community, settler community, you also have that a lot in many South European countries. So think Brazil or Argentina or Uruguay, well, in some of these cases, for instance, say Argentina or Uruguay, in terms of the approach of the settlers is not that different from the US or Australia. It just didn't work so well. Actually, Argentina worked very well up to the 1930s. It was one of the richest countries in the world, and then it entered in a downward trend that lasts until this day. But it's not that different. It's just a bunch of Europeans getting there, colonizing most of it, controlling most of it, with a small native population, and it didn't work that well.
Yes, to see what went wrong, we have to
look at the institutions that brought the culture that were these people with a different culture, the institutions that were carrying, were they different? Was the local population reacting different? I mean, many things play here. Right? I don't know if I'm giving satisfactory answers.
Yeah, you did. Moving on to the next question. I think the next one we had is kind of being answered right now. The fourth question, I think, was yours. Okay. Go on.
Now talking about decolonization.
Mhm.
In your opinion, which types of economic shocks or policy decisions proved most consequential for newly independent states' ability to stabilize and grow? And for example, how did countries with very limited human capital survive and manage in the early years of decolonization?
Yeah. Well, there are actually various waves of decolonization. We can talk of decolonization in the 19th century. That's when Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia, Venezuela, the United States, Canada, Australia became independent. And by looking at the cases in that first old wave of colonization, it looks like many of them did good. The ones that we mentioned, the 4 or 5 very richest economies in the world, actually, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So they did well in that wave of decolonization. If we're thinking of the most recent one, the one after World War II, then there it's more complicated to find positive cases. Maybe one thing, when we think of the successful cases, the really successful cases, South Korea, for instance, is clearly a successful case. Or we can start thinking now of China, which was never colonized, well, never formally colonized, but informally, yes, actually for a few decades, almost 1 century, Europeans controlled China, entered into China.
The coastal cities and,
Exactly.
and influenced the politics.
Exactly. So
Trade.
they controlled China. But China now should be considered a success case. Many other Asian countries are also sort of lifting their heads on the overall situation, such as Thailand, Indonesia. Yeah. We can't really say that they're fantastic cases, but
can we see a direct consequence of the method of decolonization that was used? Say after World War II, when most of African countries became independent, you said that the decolonization process was different. Like the Europeans just left and left no institutions, legal structures whatsoever, to what happened in 19th century independences. Did they leave other institutions or structures that made it easier for the new states to gain momentum and develop?
You mean those in the 19th century, as compared to those in?
Since we can find successful cases in those independences, what was the main difference in the decolonization process that allowed that success?
I really don't know. I mean, yeah, maybe there was a difference in the colonization process, and that's what determined that when they decolonized, they did it in a different way. I mean, the US decolonized. I mean, the funniest case is actually the Portuguese one. So it was
with Brazil.
It was the reigning dynasty that declared independence against the dynasty. The Portuguese reigning dynasty declared independence against itself.
Yeah.
So it's just all these cases are cases where what you have is say European populations declaring independence, and actually many times in the name of preserving the institutions that they brought from Europe. In the case of Asia and of Africa, it's not that case. local populations asking for a completely different way of doing things. A different way of doing things also because the colonization was different.
Not so settler driven.
Exactly. So, but legacies existed. I mean, besides the economic legacies, many of the good and bad things that the Europeans left there, but many, take the. Well, we can think of virtually any African colony. They accepted the borders that were left there. You see, they accepted the European language that became the main means of communication in countries where there are a lot of different languages, dialects or languages, properly speaking. So Portuguese is the language in which everyone understands itself, say in Angola or in Mozambique, because then if you start using the language of this there, you don't understand. Same happens with India. See.
Yeah, India.
English is
the continent itself.
exactly. So the English is the language in which you can understand yourself from one part to the other, from bottom to top of India. So yeah, the colonization. But for instance, there you go. A good side of colonization. India is one of the largest countries in the world, and it is because Britain created it as a large country. Because otherwise it could have fragment, and it did fragment when they became independent. There was this separation between the Muslim state, Pakistan, and the Hindu,
Bangladesh and India.
The Hindu state, India.
Yeah. Bangladeshis are Muslims, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And they were, but before the English colonized it as the British Raj, that huge state, they were separated even within the Hindu part.
Yeah. And Britain created one. It's not Britain. It's the process of independence and decolonization that created one of the largest countries in the world. Same with Brazil, for instance. It could have happened to Brazil. What happened to Spanish America, which was it fragmented into. But due to the fact that it was the Portuguese dynasty that declared,
and not individual,
not
communities.
But there was a tendency for different states to separate from the large new national kingdom. But it was possible to avoid that. So Brazil is one of the largest countries in the world as well, largely because it's a legacy of colonization and then of decolonization. So again, good and bad. I mean, for instance, the United States, when they declared independence, it was a small country, only the 13 colonies to the east. Then they became full country as an independent country. So you see, the conditions are they vary a lot. Yeah, you can't always find good things, not always bad things. It's a question of assessing each case. Actually, one thing that we should say is that we talk all the time of European colonization, but colonization is what history is made of. So it's empires all over history colonized.
The empires that colonized Africa and America were once.
Portugal was colonized by the Arab Empire.
The Arabs, but the Romans before.
The Romans before.
And they brought their institutions and legal norms.
Exactly. So we always keep on talking of European colonization, and this sometimes links with issues we discuss nowadays. For instance, we say many times, oh, Europeans in the Middle East, they made a mess of the Middle East. Well, Europeans were in the Middle East a few decades. Most of what exists there is the result of two empires that lasted more than 1,000 years, the Arab Empire and the Ottoman Turkish Empire. I mean, if we are to attribute responsibility,
So
we should
we
should attribute to
Turkey.
the Turks or the Arabs. I mean, it's not attributing responsibility, but when the question is, the Europeans, this and that, in the Middle East, their presence there was very short and not.
And people also generalize the Europeans, but they also include the Americans.
The American
actions
Yeah.
in the late 20th century, and also the exploration of the resources there by European companies. That might be because colonization itself, only France and England were there, and only in like Kuwait and Palestine.
And for a few years, between the end of World War One, many countries became independent in 10 years. They were under French or British mandate. So I mean, we need to be careful about. Again, my whole point is be careful about generalizations. Many of the actions of the Europeans or the Americans are awful, but this doesn't mean that awful things don't exist everywhere, and that it was always Europeans bringing either the misery of those places, or so we need to be a little more careful. I know it's easy because at a certain point, mostly in the 19th century, thanks to modern economic growth, there you go, the Europeans became so much richer and powerful that they influenced the rest of the world. So it's easy to say, it's easy to say that they had a very strong impact, but in reality, history is more complicated than that. It's satisfying for certain purposes, but not for the actual knowledge of history. You need to be. It's my approach to you with more
I agree,
context.
So now let's move to more the political systems of colonies and the state formation post-colonialism. Our first question.
How do you think that different empires governing philosophies, such as British indirect rule, French assimilation, or Japanese imperial administration, shaped the political cultures that emerged after independence?
I think that they certainly did influence. Although sometimes that's a bit overplayed. I mean, the British explicitly conducted in Africa. What's the name? Indirect rule, right? Yeah. In Africa, they did it. In other places, they did otherwise. We have just discussed that. Right? So was not always the same way of doing things. It always depended on what they found there. They practiced indirect rule, but the French, the Portuguese, they didn't practice indirect rule in such an explicit way, but they always needed to find a local, say, agents that could act on their behalf. So they always preferred certain. We know from Portuguese colonization that certain groups were favored with respect to others because they were more eager to collaborate with the Portuguese than others, and so they had a privileged position. Many times that privileged position survived after colonization. So many times what we have after colonization is the predominance of a group that was immediately before favored by the colonizing power. So there you go. Clearly an influence of colonization, but an influence of colonization playing with the realities that the colonizers found there. So yes, there were differences, but I think that in the end, there were differences in name, but the practices turned out to be similar, at least in Africa, in that respect. another example of similarities. The British, they colonized South Africa or Rhodesia with a settler community. The Portuguese also tried to do that in Angola and Mozambique. They were not successful, but they tried. They tried to do a thing of the sort. Other contributions, for instance, that also have to do with assimilation or or indirect rule. There is a country resulting from Portuguese colonization. There is entirely a Creole country, which is Cape Verde. Almost entirely Creole, a mix of Portuguese and African people and different African people. Sometimes not even Portuguese. Sometimes people from the Netherlands or from Britain went there, and they also mixed with the African population. So, if not for colonization, Cape Verde wouldn't have existence. See, so all those things are things that we need to consider when talking of colonization. But anyway. In what concerns indirect rule or assimilation as practiced in Africa, I think that sometimes the similarities are more than the difference for the reason that I said. As the Europeans never really colonized it the same way as in other parts, they always needed local agents, so they chose some local agents favored them to rule, let's say, on their behalf. But that's Africa. In other parts, it's again a question of what they found there. So the French, they also went to Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, all those countries were colonized by the French. Of course, what they found there was completely different from what they found in Algeria, northern Africa. Then, when you look outside of that clear example that you give, of course, again you find a lot of variety in the way
So what about Japan's way of ruling? Does it belong? Is it more similar to the way the French did or the British?
Oh, as a colonizing power.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It was also very short. Yeah, it was not short. So yeah, it's more in the sense of it depended on the place, and many times the presence was very short. It was a bit brutal, right? So they were they're known for
especially in China.
they're known for that. So yes,
But were they that brutal in Korea or Taiwan, which were actually colonized by Japan for a couple of years?
Yeah, for a couple of well, they were. I mean, in China they were, in Korea too. Yes, more of it was a bit of a quite clearly a militaristic venture, the Japanese approach. So they're very militaristic, and that differs a bit from some of the European colonization, which was more business driven.
Explore and exchange.
The Japanese was more militaristic, and perhaps that explains a bit more. Yeah, they were trying to build an area. Japan is, after all, a small island, not that many resources.
Yeah.
So they were trying.
The argument for that.
Yeah, that was the argument that
they
they
needed the resources
exactly. So
to feed the Japanese industry that was growing so much.
Exactly. So
early 20th century.
that's the whole point, and that explains a bit more the perhaps the brutality with which they approach. But I mean, we're talking Asia, right? So levels of literacy were much higher than you could find, say, in South America or in Africa.
Yeah, maybe the brutality is also related to how many people there were in those areas.
Exactly. So these were highly populated places.
They also had a structured society in Korea or China when compared to, say Angola or
Yeah.
or Laos by the French.
Yeah, it's much more fragmented without the same, some structure. Yes, so yeah, but there you go again. One more variety that we should
Always
add.
depends on-
We should add, and also, yeah, I mean, there's actually even before the Japanese, there's the famous Austronesian expansion, the Chinese coming from China, expanding through the Pacific. This is like 4,000 something before Christ, replacing it's replacing the Aboriginal populations that you find in many of the Pacific Islands. They were replaced by Asians, or partly, completely replaced by Asians as they expanded. They first went to Taiwan, then expanded through. That's why you find in some Pacific Islands the Aboriginal type of population, and in others the Asian type of population. Yeah, it's a famous wave of conquest, long time ago, much before
any
of the ones that we were mentioning, but that also changed. So there you go. Empires all over, colonization all over, on and on.
Then we had a question about something we've spoken previously, which was about the borders, especially in Africa, where most of the borders were lined in a random building in Berlin by European diplomats with the ruler. In America, the line between America and Canada was made by Americans and Canadians. Not respecting the indigenous population.
No, it was just an European affair. Right?
But specifically in Africa, how did...
Actually, there you go. A colonial influence. The British protected the British of Canada to prevent the US from, United States, from being the US plus Canada. For instance, the conversation that now Trump has, making of the US the 51st state, has a long history, because the US colonizers, the American colonizers, thought of making that part also part of the United States, and it was thanks to British protection that happened. So again, some
the empire protecting the colony from another colony.
So yeah.
So the question was
borders. Yeah.
The borders that were made arbitrarily in Europe by Europeans without accounting for the native populations in Africa. How did that affect the long-term economic growth of these populations?
Well, I think that again, we should take into consideration the variety. We mentioned India. India is, as you very well said, is almost a continent in itself, with a lot of variety, internal variety. It's always on the brink of breaking apart. It broke apart with this big separation between in 47, with the Muslim population going to Pakistan, the two Pakistans, Pakistan and East Pakistan, as Bangladesh was called at the time. But there's always something. First of all, because there's still a sizable Muslim population, so tensions are always very high. Then there is also the question, many times, well, there you go again, colonizations that many times we don't speak about, but there is a pre-Hindu or Muslim population that still survives, small groups. It's the Adivasis, if I'm not mistaken, is the name they have. It's the pre-Hindu Adivasi, Adivas. I believe that's the name. Adivasi. Yeah, I think that's. I may be mistaken in the actual name, but that's. There are still today. Yeah, the pre-Hindu culture. So the Hindus are not the original inhabitants of the of India. So yeah, and then even if we just ignore the big difference between Muslims and Hindus, then it's very varied. A lot. The states are very different one from another. So there's always a tension or the idea that something can happen to India. As we said, this is the result of colonization. The current borders of India are the result of colonization and decolonization, which has made one right now the largest country in the world in population terms. But there you go with all these tensions. In Africa, it was completely arbitrary, so no consideration whatsoever with the local realities. Perhaps it was more complicated because the local realities were themselves
How are you going
fragmented.
to ask the Aboriginals if they want the line here or slightly curved?
And yes, and the political units were more fluid, so it was not
Political
easy.
units?
The African.
Okay.
The ones that existed there were smaller. So inside each one of these African borders, you have like hundreds of different communities. So I mean, it was completely arbitrary. But then, when the design of the borders, but then when decolonization happened, Europeans went away. It was very difficult to go back to the type of political unit that existed before.
By now they change, and some did, some still think that belongs to them, others don't care anymore, and there's that debate.
Yeah, the problem. I guess that the problem with the African borders was many times was not exactly what they put together. Was that many times they separated a group could be separated into three different countries because the border was so arbitrary, depending on the relative strength in Europe, not low, so that you could I don't know, a border could cut a community in half, so half would be in a country, the other half in America, or even a bit in a third country. So I mean, it was completely ignoring what existed locally, and I guess a lot of the problems that Africa has to do with that. It has to do with many things. First of all, Africa itself is very varied, ethnically, culturally. It's only an European's eye that says that they're all equal. That type of silly thing.
The continent that is twice the size of Europe,
exactly.
Of course, has twice.
With a lot of variety. That Europeans don't recognize the variety. Variety is one thing. That it exists is another thing. Now that we've started to know Africa better, many Europeans now start understanding that it's completely different. The types of people and cultures that you can find in Africa. So there's that problem. It's very varied, not always friendly, quite on the contrary. So these were, like the Europeans, these were also groups that fought each other a lot of time. So it's not peaceful. It's not a peaceful continent, independently of the Europeans having been there or not. So that created a problem. And then the borders, yes, they were arbitrary, and they created a new element that was superimposed on that local reality. So, but again, there's always a local dimension. I mean, we can we have to consider that Africa before the Europeans got there was moving on its own. The cultures, the tribes, the clans, the kingdoms were all, they were moving along
They had their own
independently.
history,
Yeah,
like we do.
independently of the problem is that they don't have registered it as well as we did. So many times we don't really know what was happening, but it has been possible to reconstitute many things through archaeology. So,
Mhm.
yes, so it has its own life independently. So many times the Europeans were just one more, and not always the more important. Sometimes, yes, in some situations they were the crucial agent, but in many places they were not. The Europeans were just one more that were
Another
there.
one in that powdered keg that was
Exactly.
fighting itself.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to more recent times.
Mhm.
How did the Cold War reshape the political trajectories of newly independent countries? And to what extent can we separate post-colonial outcomes from geopolitical ones? Of course, you had like coups backed by superpowers and
Yeah,
foreign aid based on ideology.
Mhm. Yes, yes. I mean, a lot of that happened. Uh, the world was then divided into main ideas: the socialist or communist and capitalist idea. Of course, these names many times didn't mean much when applied locally. So say that Mozambique was communist after that. Okay, socialist. Uh, the ruling party was Marxist-Leninist. They defended nationalization, this and that. Uh, that was not many times very productive for these local economies. But the same would have happened if they had tried to establish a capitalist economy all of a sudden. The only thing is that many times, okay, so getting back to one step back. So yes, the Cold War played this role in the sense that the two sides, the world was divided in these two sides. And many of the newly independent countries, they thought, and this was also defended by many people in Western countries, that somehow a socialist solution would be the good solution for them to get rid of the influence of the colonizers and find an autonomous way towards development. 50 years afterwards, we can say that that didn't work very well for most of those cases. This is not to say that the opposite worked well. It's not that the capitalist solutions also worked, because the problem runs a bit deeper than that. It's what we have talked in the beginning. It's the underlying structures. These are parts of the world that had never thought of having compulsory education for most of their history. So you need that to have higher income levels. So, and their history is not made of the growth of education or of the things that are needed for for the economies to grow. So what the Cold War did was indeed one more layer in all that story, in which the countries divided along that. There, that's colonization too.
Mhm.
It's European ideas, even of the left or of the right, being imposed on realities that many times don't have anything to do with that, with those ideas. So yes, it was one more aspect of a certain form of colonization, which was many times accepted by the locals. Many times they accepted it only in name. Right? So they say,
Without knowing what it actually
we're
meant.
Marxist-Leninist, but in reality,
Because the Soviets got their
Yeah, they
weapons and aid.
and they
Communists.
adopted the idea, but of course many times that didn't mean that that much. But in some cases, it was fundamental. I mean, think North-South Korea.
Yes.
So it's a completely different story if you're in the south or if you're in the north. Or think Angola, a civil war which was fueled and stimulated by the US, the USSR, Cuba, South Africa, each on their side of the Cold War. So Angola was torn apart by this
490 years.
by geopolitical struggle, international struggle. Perhaps they would have had a civil war, but not with the help of these superpowers that existed at the time. After all, many other African countries had civil wars without the contribution of the superpowers. But in that case, we can see a direct influence of the superpowers. So it's one more layer. Perhaps at the end of the process, one thing that was something that became visible is that the conversation that socialism would be the ultimate solution, the ultimate right and ultimate solution for those countries was proved that it wasn't.
Yeah, maybe they didn't even think it through, like which one is the best. They looked at most countries that were the empires were
capitalist, so let's
naturally they'd be the opposite side.
Yeah, but it was in the end we know that it didn't work very well. So at least it's understandable perhaps that at the time they thought, well, this is the way to go. But then all these years afterwards, I guess, say that very well. Again, not to say that
Also, don't know if they be capitalist have
the same.
would have any effect.
We have example of
Korea.
no, in that case, yes, but in African countries, countries that never adopted socialism or communism, they are an equal disaster.
Yeah.
Those things. So it's not to say that capitalism would work, right? It's just that was an illusion that was lost. So we could say, well, that's not a good solution. A good solution has to be found. I swear.
Either side failed. Now, circling back to something we've already talked about as well, which were, especially in India, the pre-colonial institutions that already existed in some countries. How did that play in reinforcing the colonists, or the colonist side, or the native side, and what were its consequences on long-term economic development?
You mean the combination?
The existence of institutions and
Yeah.
a society pre-colonialism. In cases like India or I don't know, most of the other North and South America and Africa as well didn't really have that structure.
Yeah. Well, one thing we have to say is even Europe only acquired that sort of structure late. Modern economic growth is something that only happened in the last 200 years. So for the rest of the time, including time in which the Europeans were colonizing, they didn't have institutions to grow as they started growing. So we can almost say that the Europeans colonized themselves.
At that point, no one had the institutions we're talking about.
So
I'm saying
the Portuguese, they colonized Africa or India or
Brazil
or other parts of Asia. And they were not rich. They were not a rich country yet, so they were a traditional society that, like, I don't know.
You're just good at sailing,
Yeah, good at sailing.
reading the stars.
And fire guns helped too, although Chinese had already developed that before the Europeans. So actually, the Chinese in those days could be considered more sophisticated than the Europeans. So there you go. It's always complicated. I think that we have to separate two big moments in European colonization. There's the moment from the start up to the 19th century in which the Europeans were not as powerful as they became afterwards. So their colonization was always a bit superficial. They didn't have the means to.
Well, the population to.
The only case is perhaps Spain and Central and South America, but even there it was mostly sometimes because of the diseases that the Spanish brought that killed a lot of the native population. Because apart from that, I mean, certainly not in Africa. The Portuguese could impose themselves on the local African kingdoms. Many of them resisted fiercely and effectively against the Portuguese or the British, or same in Asia, right? So that's one thing. And up to the 19th century, it's not clear that the Europeans were dominating local realities. From the 19th century onwards, yes, but that's because of the development. The European countries became so rich that and so more powerful that now they could impose. So it's mostly the 19th century, the late 19th century, first half of the 20th century, where we have that impact, and that impact. Both the first impact and the later impact varied with the local institutions. There you go again. Asia was many of those Asian countries. They were on a par with Europe, or
Even
higher levels of development before the 19th century. So of course the Europeans got there, but the institutions that existed there, they resisted very well. Many times they were perhaps institutions that could bring growth in the sense that populations in Asia were more literate than
and create the synergies with the colonial powers, like we saw in India,
exactly
Portugal.
That could create different, more or less prosperous future situations. So yes, I mean, it's not to. It might sound, say that insensitive in terms of differences between people. But one thing is to talk to or try to teach engineering or economics to in the 19th century to Chinese person who has already studied. The other thing is go to the Aboriginals in Australia and try to teach them engineering. But it's not to say that these are people with different essences. It's that one has already a bit of the instruments to acquire that knowledge, the other doesn't. And this, of course, determines so a bit the future of each of those column and how they absorb.
So how easy it was to colonize these places. I mean, Australia was in its entirety colonized, whereas in China, you couldn't do it.
It wasn't possible. I mean, they could only influence. When China was very weak at the time
And fragmented.
Yeah.
That's why it was easy to exploit.
But then, never possible to go much beyond.
Not in the same way that happened with South America or North America as well.
Not there was a big European penetration, right? Yeah, because it was easy.
Majority from the colonists
Mhm.
in China, it would be impossible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's completely different. The type of, I mean, there we go. China was perhaps the most sophisticated civilization at the time. In North or South America, many of those people were still hunter-gatherers, right? When the Europeans got there at the same time, it was. So it's a completely different way of relating with the colonists.
Okay, so this is our last question.
Okay.
How have former colonies used history and collective memory in nation building? And how does the way a country narrates its colonial past influence its political stability today?
Well, it's a bit of a tricky. I left that less structured. When I was reading, I was elaborating more on the other ideas of that one, because I thought we'd never get there. But as we got there, I think that many times it's a bit what we were talking in the beginning, which is it's an attempt at legitimizing local elites. They legitimize many times themselves by saying that they liberated the country from colonialism, and they use that to justify their own power, and that is that decolonization, decolonizing legitimization means that they don't look very much to their own mechanisms of ruling, which are many times not very. So I think that it's a convenient way of excusing many of the things that the local elites don't do very well. I mean, for instance, this thing, Brazil. It's 200 years now that
They still complain about the gold.
Portugal is.
They stole our gold. That's why we're
And
still
Portugal is responsible for. But I mean, Portugal. There we go again. The question. It's true that we got the Portuguese, or the first Portuguese setting foot in Brazil was 1500, right? But colonization it didn't really start up to the late 17th century. And 1 century or so afterwards, we were gone. It was their business, and it's almost as much time they have ruled themselves than the period in which the Portuguese were there. And still, the argument is, Brazil is as it is because we were colonized by the Portuguese. I mean, it's a bit time to stop.
It's just a scapegoat to the issues.
The issues that they can't resolve. They can solve.
They fail to solve.
Very well. And the same happens too with the African colonies. It's even worse because the countries are poorer, the human situations are tragic. The European presence was associated with very awful things such as slavery. So it's easier to
blame colonization for most of the problems.
Again, slavery. See, the Europeans were there exploiting it, but it was a common practice. So we should always be careful with, again,
when blaming Europeans for slavery.
For slavery, it also existed before practice among Africans. So it's true that the Europeans made the slave trade, but the slave trade already existed before with the Arab slave trade. So many of the blame and it's not to say that the Europeans don't have anything to be blamed about on all those issues, but it's never that simple. And many times, colonization is used as a there you go, scapegoat for what they can't change for the better. And when we make the final accounting, as we did in the beginning of the conversation, well, there you go. The Europeans, they brought also good things. Colonization brought also good things, such India being such a large country, or technologies that were brought that perhaps would never develop autonomously in those places. After all, that's the argument that many times is used to say that we benefited from the Arab presence in the Orientalism because they brought things that we didn't know how to. It was good, right? Or the Roman Empire, the same thing. Well, the Europeans also brought good. They also brought bad. But a different thing is the conversation of blaming colonization for all the evils of each of these countries, which, I mean, it's convenient for the local elites. Many times, elites that are not that are unaccountable. I mean, there's no accountability for what they do. The elections are not free. They're not really chosen by most of the people, and then they use that sort of argument very easily. So yes, these narratives are complicated. The Europeans, they have developed a bit of a guilt complex about all of this, with that, which goes very well along this attitude of the post-colonial elites. So yes, but they say, well, it's the European. Many times, yes, yes, of course. Sorry for what we have done, but it's not that simple. And that's my take. My take on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those were the questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for participating.
Okay.
And yeah, that's it.
And stay tuned for the next episode.